Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on the program today. I'm Joaquin Rogers in Lagos, Nigeria. Here's what's coming up this hour. India and Canada engaged the diplomatic row over the murder of a Canadian Sikh separatist leader. Both countries expelled their ambassadors. We continue our coverage of the UN General Assembly holding in New York as we anticipate President Bola Tinubu's first address on the world stage. Plus, Libyans protest the city of Derna over government's response to the recent flood disaster. The World Today starts right now. Thanks for staying with us, everyone. We're following a developing story of Canada as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau expresses his concerns over the killing of a leader of a Sikh temple in the country named Hardeep Singh Nija. Mr. Trudeau said the Indian government needs to take the matter with the utmost seriousness. He also says Canadian intelligence is pursuing credible allegations of a link between Hardeep's death and the Indian state. On the evening of June 18, Canadian police found Hardeep Singh Nija with multiple gunshot wounds in his pickup truck, which was in the car park of the Guru Nanak Sikh Gurdwara temple in the Surrey, British Columbia. Nija succumbed to his injuries at the scene, and local police later said that he had been shot by two masked men. Nija was the temple's president and a prominent Sikh leader who publicly campaigned for Khalistan, the creation of an independent Sikh homeland in the Punjab region of India. His killing remains unsolved. Earlier, the Canadian Foreign Minister announced an Indian diplomat had been expelled, saying if proven true, it will be a great violation of Canada's sovereignty and of the most basic rule of how countries deal with each other. Security has been stepped up at the Canadian High Commission in Delhi, but all has been quiet so far, and there have been no reports of protests breaking out in and out of the complex, but authorities are not taking chances.
Any involvement of a foreign government in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil is an unacceptable violation of our sovereignty. It is contrary to the fundamental rules by which free, open, and democratic societies conduct themselves. As you would expect, we've been working closely and coordinating with our allies on this very serious matter.
Is said to have the highest population of Sikhs outside their home state of Punjab in India, and the country has been the site of many protests that have irked India. Regarding this issue, India has firmly rejected Mr. Trudeau's allegations, calling them absurd and politically motivated. India has also expelled a senior Canadian diplomat after Mr. Trudeau suggested Delhi may have been involved in the murder of the separatist leader. It says Canada had long provided shelter to Khalistani terrorists and extremists who threaten India's security. Other countries have reacted to the incident, with Britain saying it's in close touch with Canada about the serious allegations. The US says it's deeply concerned and called for the perpetrators to be brought to justice, while the World Sikh Organization of Canada has condemned the killing and called on India to cooperate with the Canadian government over the investigation.
We have a mixed kind of emotion right now. That's kind of, one is we're acknowledging that Canada has acknowledged India as an actor and done it from Parliament. And on the other side, we're wondering what the next steps are going to be as well. So I think there's mixed feelings at the moment.
And more on India's reaction to Canada expelling its diplomat. India expelled a Canadian diplomat, giving him 5 days to leave the country. However, the Canadian High Commissioner in New Delhi, Cameron McKay, was seen entering and leaving India's foreign ministry without giving a comment after he was summoned and told of the expulsion decision. A spokesperson from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Homicide Team says the inquiry into the killing of Hardeep Nija is a priority investigation. He says they will continue to work closely with local, provincial, and national police agencies and partners in order to advance the investigation. The VOA's national correspondent, Steve Herman, was the VOA's South Asia Bureau Chief in New Delhi from 2007 up till 2010. He joins us now to discuss this row between the two countries. Steve, great to see you today.
Pleasure to be here.
Right, so why is this such a dividing issue between the two countries?
Well, this is unprecedented. We have a spat involving two members of the group of 7 nations, where one of them is accusing the other, which happens to be the world's largest democracy, of essentially carrying out a political assassination on its territory. This is something that's unprecedented.
And the Canadian government says it's investigating, but still pointing accusing fingers at the Indian government. This is almost like the Khashoggi case. How likely could India have had a hand in Hardeep's murder?
Well, Canada has not produced any evidence yet, although we're hearing today that it is going to make some of this evidence public. And of course, India is calling this absurd. But if there is compelling evidence, conclusive evidence, it's going to be a huge international embarrassment for India, and is going to have ramifications both outside of India and potentially within the country itself. Because one question that will obviously be asked is, how high up did this go in India? Did the Prime Minister have prior knowledge? Did he order it? Did Narendra Modi get informed about this after it happened? So some huge questions that will have to be answered.
Have been expelled in both countries. This could result in some serious consequences, right?
Well, I think we're already seeing serious consequences. You know, we see from time to time, Russia and the United States, or China and a European country might have these sort of tit-for-tat expulsions of diplomats who were essentially spies operating under diplomatic cover, or just a sort of retaliatory efforts. But to have this happen between two of the most significant democracies in the world is really remarkable, and will have tremendous geopolitical ramifications.
And this, has drawn the attention of world leaders who are calling for better investigation and for, better cooperation. How important is the advice of all watching developments in Canada?
Well, you have pressure now on New Delhi from not only Washington, but also the Australians and the Brits as well. We do know that the Canadians shared their information with U.S. officials, and apparently U.S. intelligence agencies may have had a role in helping to develop the information that led to Canada making these very explosive allegations against India.
And Steve, has the Sikh community enjoyed any good relationship with Canada, let's say, in the last few years?
Yes, Canada has the largest population of Sikhs outside of the Punjab region in India. They are a tremendous force, not only in British Columbia, but throughout India, or throughout Canada. One of the leaders of the opposition, one of the opposition parties in Canada, is a Sikh. Also, we've had a Sikh who was a former defense minister, and it's probably inevitable that one day in the future there will be a Sikh prime minister of Canada. So a very significant and influential minority in Canada.
Right, Steve, a pleasure having you on the program today, and thanks for the update on that situation.
My pleasure.
To another diplomat, this time in China, as we are learning the country's former foreign minister, Queen Gang, who was ousted from his position in July this year, had an extramarital affair while he was ambassador to the United States. A report by the Wall Street Journal says Queen was cooperating with the investigations, which was now focused on whether the affair or his conduct had compromised China's national security. Senior Chinese officials were told that an internal Communist Party investigation found him engaged in the affair throughout his tenure as China's ambassador to the United States. The report said two sources told the newspaper that the affair had resulted in the birth of a child in the U.S. China's foreign ministry has not responded to a request to comment on the WSJ report. 5 Americans freed from Iran have made an emotional return to the United States today, ending their imprisonment nightmare a day after they were swapped for 5 Iranians held in the U.S. and the unfreezing of $6 billion in Iranian funds. Coming off the plane, the returning Americans were embraced by family and friends with smiles, laughs, and visible emotion. Video footage from the airport showed all of this. Now, the welcome ceremony followed a carefully choreographed exchange agreed after months of Qatar-mediated talks that was triggered on Monday when the funds that had been blocked in South Korea were wired via Switzerland to banks in Doha. After the transfer was confirmed, the 5 U.S. prisoners plus 2 relatives took off on a Qatari plane from Tehran at the same time as 2 of the 5 Iranian detainees landed in Doha on their way home. 3 Iranians chose not to go to Iran.
Amazing. It's amazing. Unbelievable. We're so grateful to be together after 8 years. It's unbelievable. Almost 8 years to the day. It's unbelievable. We're so grateful. It's just, you feel like it's a dream. The nightmare is finally over. I've dreamt about this moment, and each time I've woken up and just been in this belief, like, why am I dreaming these dreams and not happening? And today and tonight it happened. So thank you everyone for your support. It's just been a very, very rough 8 years, but it's amazing to be together. Thank you everyone. The real hero of this story, surviving 8 years of brutal treatment, but never losing hope. And showing what happens when you're hopeful, when you fight. Why am I saying this? Yeah. It's over. I'm done. I'm done. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We haven't had this moment in over 8 years. It really is. I'm not going to use explicit. It's just unbelievable. It's surreal. And we take it for granted having a family together. We've been apart for 8 years, and finally we're together. And it's just completely unbelievable. And we're grateful for this moment, really. And we've got to start building our lives again. Huh?
Now let's bring in geopolitical analyst Edward Akbar. He's in Texas, the United States. Thank you for joining us today on the program, Edward.
Thank you for having me.
So these Americans are returning, all thanks to a swap deal brokered with Iran. Was this a fair deal?
I think, it is commendable, when America goes after, Americans, held up in whatever country for whatever reason, and they come home. Freedom has no price in it. And so I commend the administration and President Biden and all the diplomats and family members who, played a role to see this happen. So, let those people now get back to, life and what does Iran stand to benefit? What does America stand to benefit? The question is there any price to put on life and freedom? We don't want to go into what led to what, but, countries have learned, since 1970, when the Shah, thing happened and American hostages were held, I think some countries are very good in doing this, and they use it to extract some sort of benefit for their country. But, can we come to a time where this thing doesn't happen and people can be free and move around the world? I don't know whether there's any answer to that question.
And there are also, many Americans held by different governments around the world. You say that it's commendable, when America is able to secure their release from wherever they are, but there are some deterrent countries. Do you believe that the U.S. should negotiate similar deals with those held elsewhere?
Well, again, the American citizenship, gives to every American the right to go everywhere. And then once an American is held somewhere, it's the duty of the government, through the embassies to find out what's, is going on. I don't think, it would make sense for if an American goes to another country and violates, the rules of those countries and then expect to, to get freedom out of it. So, we Americans should also respect the rule of law in those countries and stay away from things that will make us, fall into the hands of a regime that may be unfriendly towards America. Because, America is the big elephant in the room, and anybody or everybody wants to do something to see if they can get their attention. So yes, if there are Americans all over, but it has to be people that are held, maybe because a regime, for instance, in North Korea or Russia, that are anti-America, because of policies, they are always looking for an opportunity to hold. But if an American goes over there and commits crime, in violation of the domestic laws of those countries, I don't think American government should waste our taxpayers' resources to go and free them. But if it's just, you're reporting on something, but again, what are the violations? Sometimes those violations are very flimsy. You don't even know, and then they grab you, and that's the thing. It becomes a diplomatic, tug of war.
And the U.S. already has a frosty relationship with Iran, which is the country in question now. Could this deal help thaw some of that, do you believe?
No, not necessarily. There's a festering anger has been lingering since 1953. When America, when America went in and overthrew a democratically elected government of Iran, at the urge of UK. I think it was the grandson of Roosevelt.
Oh, I believe with pictures frozen there, having some network issues with Edward. We'll try to get back to him to finish off this conversation. But in the meantime, let's... Right, Edward, you could just complete your thoughts. We lost you a little while back.
Okay, so what I'm saying, back in 1953, is when this, roller coaster with Iran started, because America went in and overthrew a democratically elected president of Iran. And so Iranians have had this national pride that they're going to inflict whatever injury they can on America or on Americans. So I'm hoping that as we advance in our relationships, that some of these, people begin to recognize, as a human being, we don't want to be the chess on the board being played for against based on whomever is occupying power at the time. Hopefully it will lead to something, but I seriously doubt it, because America still looks at Iran as a terrorist nation, or like George Bush said, axis of evil. Those classifications on countries usually goes to anger people, and because countries are made up of people, and there are going to be people who just feel insulted or disrespected if a world leader makes an unfriendly comment about them. So again, you never know. We always say, hope this is the last time, but in world geopolitical issues, it's just never a last time, because you don't know what is going to happen next.
Right, so I'm wondering about the different circumstances that play out when, a prisoner swap occurs, especially, with countries that are not so friendly with each other. So what do you think could happen to these prisoners that have been freed?
Again, in the human mind, if we all can predict, human conduct, I think we will have come up with a science that, that we all can be happy with. But, the human mind is such a complex facility that you never know what somebody's going to do. So the prisoners go back, for how many years? I mean, the prisoners from the American side coming home, what are they going to do? Of course, they're going to want to, enjoy the period, and they have now. And then the ones going back to Iran, what are they going to do? Are they going to be angry? Because, anger is something that sometimes you don't know how to dictate in people until they act out, until they do something. So I don't know. I wish I had a magic wand or a crystal ball to say, hey, this is what they're going to do. But I'm hoping that, the peace the world been wanting to achieve ever since we found each other, one day, become a common thing. But I seriously doubt it.
Right. Edward, thanks once again.
Well, thank you for having me, and you're looking pretty good on that outfit.
Thank you. So let's move on. Ovidio Guzman, one of the sons of incarcerated Mexican drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, has pleaded not guilty to U.S. Fentanyl trafficking charges in federal court in Chicago. The 33-year-old extradited from Mexico is one of El Chapo's 4 sons, known as Los Chapitos, who inherited their father's trafficking empire after his conviction on U.S. murder and drug charges in 2019. Excuse me. Guzman is serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison in Colorado.
No, sorry. He's not planning on cooperating against his brothers.
Is he planning to cooperate on any other issues?
This is the case right now. We're going to review the discovery. We're going to decide what we're going to do after we look at it, see what the evidence is. And, it's kind of just too early. I mean, the evidence against the sons is not necessarily the evidence against the fathers. The father's been in prison since, it's been about 8 or 9 years by now, so things have changed dramatically in terms of the evidence. So I've got to review a completely different case. It's way too early to have an idea at this point. I just don't know the size of the discovery. We have 60 days for a status conference. We may or may not seek more time to get the discovery, and we just kind of go from there.
You talked a little about anxiety, depression. Have you noticed that in him?
He misses his family. I mean, he's got children, he's got a wife, so I think that certainly it would impact anybody's mental state. He's a human being, he's a sensitive guy, he's quiet, and he's reflective, so this has not been an easy time for him. And now he's in a country that he's barely ever been in, knows nothing of the customs here, and he's facing the rest of his life in prison. So if that doesn't give somebody anxiety and depression, I don't know what would.
Azerbaijan's defense ministry has warned that civilians could leave the Karabakh region via humanitarian corridors established on the Lachin road to Armenia and in other directions. It urged civilians to stay away from what it described as legitimate military targets being attacked by Azerbaijani forces as part of Baku's anti-terrorist operation. Reporters on the ground have been able to confirm the location of buildings, road layout, walkways, trees, and signs seen in the video, which matched satellite imagery of the area. Russia, on the other hand, Armenia and Azerbaijan. Russia has urged Armenia and Azerbaijan to stop bloodshed in the breakaway region of Nagorno-Karabakh, where Azerbaijan began mass artillery strikes on Tuesday. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said that Russia is worried by the escalation and that Moscow's peacekeepers in the region would continue with their mission. According to her, we are receiving information about it from various sources. We are deeply worried about sharp escalation of the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. We received messages about the start of what Baku calls anti-terrorist undertakings in the region also about the response from the local Armenian armed forces. Russia strongly encourages the conflicting sides to stop the bloodshed, stop the military actions at once, and return to political and diplomatic settlement. A Moscow court has declined to consider the latest appeal by U.S. reporter Ivan Guskovich against his pre-trial detention nearly 6 months after his arrest on spying charges that he denies. The United States has designated Guskovich and Paul Whelan, an American convicted of espionage in 2020 and serving 16 years in Russian penal colony, as wrongfully detained, meaning that it considers the cases against them to be bogus and politically motivated. The court's press service announced the decision without explanation after a closed hearing. State news agency RIA said the appeal was being sent back to a lower court because of unspecified procedural violations. Guskovich, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, was arrested on March 29 in the Ural city of Yekaterinburg on charges of espionage that carry up to 20 years in prison. In other news, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has urged participants of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Germany to continue to supply air defense systems to Kyiv, saying air defense is saving lives. Austin hosted another contact group meeting at U.S. Ramstein Air Base in Western Germany, where some 50 countries supporting Ukraine were represented. Separately, Canadian Defense Minister Bill Blair commented on the June murder of a Sikh separatist leader in British Columbia, saying Canada had received very credible intelligence that agents of the Indian government were involved in the extrajudicial killing.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. Air defense is saving lives. So I urge this group to continue to dig deep on ground-based air defense for Ukraine. And we must continue to push hard to provide Ukraine with the air defense systems and interceptors that it needs. And right now, in the heat of battle, we must also keep pushing to get Ukraine the ammunition that it needs to keep up the fight, including 155 millimeter ammunition. And meanwhile, the United States and our allies and partners have proven our staying power over and over again. So make no mistake, we will stand by the Ukrainian people for the long haul. Since our last meeting, the United States has committed additional security assistance packages totaling more than $2 billion. Those packages include urgently needed air defense, ammunition, and mine clearing equipment.
Well, first of all, let me say that we are very concerned. We are in receipt of very credible intelligence, and there now is an ongoing criminal investigation in my country with respect to allegations that agents of the Indian government were involved in the extraterritorial killing, the extrajudicial killing of a Canadian citizen in Canadian soil. That's completely contrary to all international rule of law and totally unacceptable in our country. We've expressed our concern, and as you're probably also aware, our Foreign Affairs Department has recently removed from our country a member of the Indian intelligence services who we believe has some responsibility for the concerns that we've raised. This matter is a very important and significant matter of criminal investigation in our country.
In the meantime, Ukraine has told the UN's highest court in The Hague that Russia justified waging war against Ukraine by invoking a terrible lie, namely that Moscow's invasion was to stop an alleged genocide. Ukraine's representative Anton Korynevich called on the International Court of Justice to decide that it has jurisdiction to hear the case fully and eventually rule that Russia must pay reparations for invading under a false pretext. On Monday, Russia urged the ICJ, also known as the World Court, to throw out the case, claiming Kyiv's legal arguments were hopelessly flawed. Ukraine brought the case before the ICJ days after the Russian invasion on February 24 last year.
Russia is waging war against my country in the name of this terrible lie that Ukraine is committing genocide against its own people. This lie is Russia's pretext for aggression and conquest. Russia has presented no credible evidence. It cannot. In reality, Russia has turned the Genocide Convention on its head. The international community adopted the Genocide Convention to protect. Russia invokes the Genocide Convention to destroy. Russia accused Ukraine of committing genocide. It launched a full-scale invasion for the stated purpose of stopping genocide. In other words, Russia abused and violated the Genocide Convention by using allegations of genocide as a pretext for a full-scale invasion. But Russia is not above the law. It must be held accountable. Can it truly be the case that a state can abuse the Genocide Convention to justify a war of conquest? Can a state use false allegations of genocide as a pretext to destroy cities, bomb civilians, and deport children from their homes? And when the Genocide Convention is so cynically abused, is this court powerless? The answer to these questions must be no. It must be no for the sake of the Ukrainian people, who remain under brutal attack. And it must be no for the sake of the world, to prevent international law from being twisted into a tool for human rights abuses and destruction.
And the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in New York for the UNGA, but before heading to meetings with other world leaders, he met with wounded Ukrainian soldiers at a New York City hospital. In his first in-person visit to the 193-member world body since Russia's February 2022 invasion, Mr. Zelensky is due to speak to the annual General Assembly of World Leaders today. He traveled straight from the airport after landing in New York on Monday to Staten Island University Hospital, where Ukrainian soldiers have been treated for amputations. After New York, he will travel to Washington, where he's expected to meet with U.S. President Joe Biden and members of the Congress. In a post on Telegram, Mr. Zelensky said he also plans to meet military and business officials.
Only one dream, to live and to come back, of course.
I'm Mike Dowling. I'm the President and CEO of Northwell Health. And for those that don't know, Staten Island University Hospital is one of our largest facilities. And I want to begin by complimenting everybody here at the hospital for everything that you're doing to help with the situation in Ukraine as much as we possibly can, because it's a big healthcare issue, it's a humanitarian issue, and what President Zelensky is doing, obviously, is protecting democracy and protecting the way of life for the rest of us, so it's unbelievably important. And so we're delighted to be doing this, the little piece that we can do. We've sent lots of supplies to the Ukraine, and we will continue to do that. We have lots of ambulances going to the Ukraine beginning next week. We have a telemedicine program that connects with the hospitals and the doctors and the nurses in the Ukraine. We're going to be working on mental health issues in the Ukraine. President Zelensky's wife is very, very involved, obviously, along with a lot of other people on mental health. So it's our privilege to be able to help any way we possibly can. We will continue it. What you're doing, Mr. President, is absolutely extraordinary. What happens in Ukraine is important to all of us. This is not an issue just for over there. This is an issue that protects us here. And as you said on television last night, that this is a protection of democracy and of the Western way of life. And so we thank you, Mr. President, for everything that you're doing, and of course all of the people here.
For us, very important that all our words, all our messages will be heard by our partners. And if in the United Nations still, it's a pity, but still, there is the place for Russian terrorists, it's the question, not to me, I think it's a question to all the members of the United Nations.
Now, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu has continued his drive to attract investments and economic development into the country, holding a meeting with the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa in New York City on the sidelines of the 78th United Nations General Assembly. In a statement after the meeting, spokesperson to the president, Ajuri Ngalale, stated that President Tinubu had made the case for Africa to insist that the hundreds of billions of dollars spent through international development finance institutions over the years must meet the specific needs of developing democracies on the continent. Our State House correspondent, Larry Lasisi, reports from New York.
President Bola Tinubu arriving for what turned out to be a day of meetings. His first meeting with one of the leaders who had arrived in New York for the 78th United Nations General Assembly is with the South African President, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. The spokesperson to President Tinubu, Ajuri Ngalale, in a statement after the meeting, said President Tinubu had discussed the need for funds spent through international development finance institutions to meet the specific needs of developing democracies in Africa. According to the statement, President Tinubu said, "Democracy without food on the table is a breeding ground for what will consume us if care is not taken. We must join hands and agree that international finance institutions require reform, as Africa is not a ground for economic scavenging any longer, but it is a place with gifted people that is ready for investment and cooperation." The South African president is said to have agreed that the two countries have much more wealth to create together in close and intentional partnership, with each country leveraging on each other's respective strengths. Following this meeting, the president met with some governors led by the chairman of the Nigerian Governors Forum, Governor Abdulrazak Abdurrahman of Kwara State. After the meeting, the governor spoke on the benefit of their presence at the 78th United Nations General Assembly.
There are several engagements, side meetings, side events, many on education, SDG, healthcare, which the countries are engaging in. And the subnational are also engaging in all side events as well.
The Minister of Solid Minerals, Mr. Dele Alake, also had a meeting with some potential investors in the Nigerian solid mineral industry.
I have assured him and the rest of the investing globe that Nigeria is ready and open to serious time investors. And we are creating all the conducive conditions and putting in incentives and environments via security, stepping up the security around the mining sites, putting in governance structure, very effective and efficient governance structure.
Many more bilateral engagements are expected in the days ahead as officials meet with counterparts from different countries. From New York, Lanre Lasisi for Channels Television News.
Meanwhile, world leaders and ministers have been engaging in high-level UN discussions in New York amid the need to build global connections with government leaders. Our correspondent Maria Bird has more.
General Assembly high-level meetings open with a focus on climate change, health inequality, and the need to address security issues across the world. The world is watching as the summit works to address global challenges with hunger and poverty that have been heightened as a result of a health pandemic and war.
Despite commitments to eradicate poverty and to reduce hunger being at the core of this agenda, Alarmingly, 1.2 billion people were still living in multidimensional poverty.
The SDGs aren't just a list of goals. They carry the hopes, dreams, rights, and expectations of people everywhere. Yet today, only 15% of the targets are on track, and many are going in reverse.
Despite the Assembly's plans to pick up the pace on implementing development efforts across the world, many convened in New York City in front of the UN building protesting the government. These anti-government protests focused on dissatisfaction with government leadership. New York City is one of the largest cities in the world with over 8.5 million people and continues to serve the UN General Assembly with extended security and increased accessibility to government leaders and ministers that are attending the 78th UN General Assembly, with an intentional focus on reaching the UN 2030 agenda. From New York City, Maria Bird, Channels Television News.
In the meantime, U.S. President Joe Biden has appealed to world leaders at the UN General Assembly to stand with Ukraine against Russian invaders, hoping Republicans in the Congress will also take notice. Mr. Biden drew applause when saying that the United States and its allies would stand with Ukraine's fight for freedom. Russia alone bears responsibility for this war. Russia alone has the power to end this war immediately. Mr. Biden's address at the annual gathering was the centerpiece event of his 3-day visit to New York, which will include meetings with the heads of 5 Central Asian nations and the leaders of Israel and Brazil.
For green products in carbon-intense sectors like concrete, shipping, aviation, and trucking, to the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate, which is bringing farmers into the climate solution and making our food supply more resilient to climate shocks. And the Global Methane Pledge, now endorsed by more than 150 countries, which expands our focus beyond our carbon emission targets to reduce the potential greenhouse gases in our atmosphere by 30% in this decade. It's all within our capacity. We need to bring the same commitment and urgency and ambition as we work together to meet the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. These goals were adopted at the United Nations in 2015 as a roadmap for improving lives around the world. But the hard truth is, for decades of progress, the world has lost ground these past years in the wake of COVID-19, conflicts, and other crises. The United States is committing to doing its part. All told, in the first 2 years of my administration, the United States has invested more than $100 billion to drive development progress in bolstering food security, expanding access to education worldwide, strengthening healthcare systems, and fighting disease. And we've helped mobilize billions more in the private sector investments. But to accelerate our forward progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, we all have to do more. We need to build new partnerships that change the way we tackle this challenge, to unlock trillions of additional financing for development, drawing on all sources. We need to fill the gaps and address the failures of our existing system exposed by the pandemic. We need to ensure that women and girls benefit fully from our progress. We must also do more to grapple with the debt that holds back so many low and middle-income countries. When nations are forced to service unsustainable debt payments over the needs of their own people, it makes it harder for them to invest in their own futures. And as we work together to recover from global shocks, the United States will also continue to be the largest single country donor of humanitarian assistance at this moment of unparalleled need in the world.
Now let's talk to our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird, who's also at the UNGA in New York. Maria, great to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, so President Biden spoke at the UN General Assembly today. He spoke extensively about climate change, sustainable development goals, and of course, he also touched upon other bilateral issues, including the issue between Russia and Ukraine. There was a lot of anticipation for President Biden's speech today. Was he able to cover all of the hot topics in his address?
He's covered a good bit of the hot topics. I think, when you look at what he focused in on, obviously the war in Ukraine is an underpinning for a second year with the summit. And so that obviously was a huge part of his discussion points, especially as you look at the amount of resources across the world that are being sent over to Ukraine, and looking at some of the economic challenges that many countries across the world are experiencing, which means our global economy in some ways are suffering. So he had to, and which he did, address the issues around Ukraine. One of the things that here in the U.S. Was discussed just a few days ago with President Zelensky of Ukraine was the challenge: if the world does not continue to put resources into Ukraine, then we could potentially see a third world war. And I think that is what is stemming the President Biden's response and his focus on Ukraine during the session. Obviously, there could have been a lot more conversation around climate change. It was briefly discussed, but climate change obviously has impacted the entire world and will continue to unless we begin to put some heavy emphasis there. And that, I think, ties into his focus on the war, ties into some of the development issues that are the highlighted points of the 78th session, and how the development efforts need to be the push forward as we're looking at not only aid efforts, but development across the world.
Indeed, Maria, and there will be more speeches today up until Nigerian President Bola Tinubu's speech later tonight, Lagos time. What has been the central theme today?
Yes, that speech, I mean, President Tinubu will be the fifth president to speak from the continent. And I think that when you look at what are going to be the focal points in that discussion, you know that obviously development is a huge area of discussion. When you look at the focal point for this summit, it's rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity, accelerating action for the 2030 agenda. So those are going to be sustainable development, are going to be areas of concern and discussion points. Several topics that we know he will probably be hitting on: sustainable development, climate change, global cooperation. There's going to be a lot of focus, again, on economic investment. We know that development heavily depends on the economic investment. Will there be discussions around security? I think that is going to be another discussion point, and around global humanitarian crises that exist, especially as we talk about security and peace across the world.
And have any of the leaders raised any issues important to Africa?
Leaders have raised many issues that are important to the continent. I think one of the things that we're going to see, and hopefully we'll begin to see in more of the speeches, not only from the presidents in the continent, but presidents across the world and world leaders and ministers across the world, are real issues around development, issues around sustainability, issues around investment. And when you look at some of where the world is going and the reliance on the continent, I think is where you're going to begin to see greater conversations around some of the reliance and the movement forward that the world must do in order to not only look at their own individual countries and continents, but also being inclusive in how we're all interconnected.
Thank you so much, Maria, for giving us an update on the ongoing UN General Assembly meeting in New York.
Thank you.
Well, still ahead on the program. Okay, right. Let's just continue on the world today. After 1 week after the flood that swept the city center of Derna into the sea, Libyans rallied outside the Al-Shahaba mosque in the city on Monday to protest against the government. Crowds shouted and carried placards drawing attention to the devastation in the city. Dams above the city burst in a storm a week ago, sending a huge torrent down a seasonal river that runs through the center of the city of 120,000 people. And so in other news today, marks 1 year since the funeral of Britain's Queen Elizabeth. Huge crowds gathered in central London to witness the Queen's funeral procession as the nation mourned the monarch who died aged 96 after 7 decades on the throne. The death marked an end of an era for Britain. During her reign, she had become not just Britain's figurehead, but also a huge presence on the world stage. British government departments spent an estimated total of £161.7 million on Queen Elizabeth's state funeral and related events, according to the Treasury. Elsewhere now, elderly residents of Fukushima have shared their wisdom and secret of long and healthy life during the Respect for the Aged today at the Senior Citizens event on Monday. Respect for Senior Citizens meetings are held annually across Japan each September since 1966 to express gratitude to those who have built the local community. Suneko Kanta, a 94-year-old resident and dance team member, says, "I don't really have a goal for my life. Everyone says 100 years old, but that's just not possible. My goal is to do my best each day and get along with everyone." In Shimizu district of Fukushima, where the event was held, there were approximately 4,500 senior citizens aged 77 or older who were eligible for the celebration, and approximately 300 of them participated. All participants were given towels as souvenirs, while 5,000 yen were given to those who reached the age of 88, a milestone celebration age in Japan, as a congratulatory gift. That wraps up the world today. Thank you for watching. I'm Joaquin Rogers. See you next time.